Deutschland ist Weltmeister!
Argentina have won the World Cup!
Campione del mondo!
The World Cup tournament could be the first footballing memory for most fans, the gate or introduction to this beautiful sport. Baggio's penalty against Brazil in '94,
He's missed it! And Brazil win the World Cup!
Zidane's double in the '98 final, the Fenomeno coming back from injury in 2002,
Ronaldo is rampant now!
Grosso's goal in 2006. It's a competition that attracts the masses because of how easily digestible it is in terms of narrative. In the end, it's vastly different countries competing against each other for the most prestigious prize in football. The newest iteration in Qatar has started, and I thought it would be interesting to answer a simple question: which is the strongest World Cup in history? In my most recent study, I tried to answer a similar question, but in the European club competitions. A combination of domestic league rankings plus European league coefficients helped me build an algorithm to calculate the strength of the competitions from different eras. National team competitions are different when applying the same method. Calculating relative strength is trickier between national teams because qualifiers for tournaments are always region exclusive. So with that said, head-to-head matches between teams from different continents only happen in the World Cup, and the last playoff qualifiers for the World Cup, which is called the Inter-Confederation Playoff, and official friendlies. All of these facts pointed me towards using Elo Ratings. Elo Ratings were invented to calculate the relative skill levels of chess players. It is the official system used in many top chess tournaments today. It is named after the physics professor Arpadillo, who created the system in the 60s. The rating system essentially uses the difference in ratings between two players as a predictor of the outcome of a match, and this rating reflects the strength of a player. The rating increases or decreases depending on the outcome of a match. The rating difference between the two sides before a match will determine how much points are gained or lost for each side. If a team has a lower rating than his opponent, he's considered an underdog, and if he won, he'll gain a lot of points. And all of this depends on the Elo algorithm. I will not explain it here as there are many videos that can explain the topic better than me. I just wanted to paint a simple picture of the system before using it in my study. What made Elo appropriate for my study was the rating's ability in reflecting relative strength between any team. This means that this rating system can be used to rank different national teams from different continents. I used a website called eloratings.net. What's great about it was that it had Elo ratings of each national team since the beginning of the 20th century. The author of the website built this database by using the Elo algorithm and using official national team results from the International Football Data Archives. The original algorithm needs a weight factor within it, so the website assigns different weights for different national team competitions. World Cup matches have the highest weight within the algorithm, while friendlies are assigned with the lowest weight, and between them are the qualifiers and regional competitions. At each point in history, different national teams would have different Elo ratings depending on their performances. Let's take a simple and unfortunate example. Our Kuwaiti national team had gone through different periods throughout history. At their absolute peak, their Elo rating got to 1,728 after winning the Asian Cup in 1980. Unfortunately now, their Elo rating is at 1,298 after their loss against Jordan in the Asian qualifiers. Elo ratings will help us compare different national teams from different eras as much as possible. Of course, the method is tricky, but in my opinion, it's the most accurate way to compare and do studies. The purpose of the study is to rank all World Cup competitions in history in terms of strength of the tournament by using average Elo of the tournament, difficulty of the path by using average path Elo, strongest winners by using the Elo of the champions, and the overall difficulty of the triumph, or ODR as I call it. All the parameters will be explained as we go. In this study, I'll use the Elo rating of each team after the end of the tournament. This should be the best timing to represent each national team, as the rating will reflect all the matches after a chosen iteration. To demonstrate all the discussed calculations, let's take a more recent example, the 2018 World Cup.
France are the champions of the world!
These are the national teams that participated. and those are their Elo ratings after the end of the tournament. We'll calculate the strength of the tournament by adding up and averaging all the Elo ratings. Of course, we'll use the average because throughout history, different World Cups had different number of participants. In 2018, there were 32 teams. In 1994, there were 24. In 1978, there were 16. And in 1930, there were only 13 participants. An average Elo rating for the participants will make it easier to compare between different iterations and rank them easily. The average tournament Elo for this iteration was 1,828, which is ranked as the 10th strongest tournament in World Cup history. The second parameter we will calculate is the difficulty of the path, or in other words, the average Elo rating of all the opponents the World Cup winner has faced to clinch the title. Some paths are easier than others, and this will help us calculate the ODR later on, which calculates the overall difficulty of the triumph. In 2018, France were world champions. These were all the teams they faced from the group stage all the way to the final against Croatia, and these are their Elo ratings. The total points are 13,341, and the average is 1,906. In other words, France faced opponents with an average of 1,906 Elo rating to claim the title. So where does this path rank historically? It's considered the 6th hardest path in history, which is pretty high, given that the recent iterations have 32 participants, which sometimes translate into an overall weaker competition. With the Elo rating of the World Cup winners France, we now have all the needed numbers to calculate the last parameter, which is the ODR formula. This formula simply gauges the difficulty in winning the World Cup in each iteration. Each World Cup has different circumstances and each winner has different paths. The ODR will attempt to make it easier to rank these different triumphs. The ODR formula needs 3 pieces of data: the average tournament Elo plus the average path Elo, their total minus the winner team Elo. A very straightforward formula. Let's go back to our example. The champions Elo rating, which is the Elo of France, 2,126. The average tournament Elo is 1,828. The average path Elo of France was 1,906, and the formula would look like this. And the result is 1,608. We'll divide that by 100 to make it more presentable, and the ODR of the 2018 World Cup is 16.08. These are all the formulas and calculations I'll use in this episode. Let's now talk about the results and final rankings. Whenever FIFA decides to expand the number of participants within the World Cup, we hear the same old criticism from the media and the fans. This decision will weaken the overall level of the competition. And it makes sense. More national teams means a bigger chance for weaker teams to qualify and weaken the overall level of the competition. I'll try to prove this theory in the study by first ranking each World Cup iteration in terms of overall strength of the tournament by using the average tournament Elo rating. Let's start with the 5 strongest World Cup iterations in history. In 5th position, the 1974 World Cup in West Germany. 16 nations participated and the average tournament Elo is 18.7. Despite having relatively weak footballing nations like Haiti, Zaire, and an inexperienced Australian team, the competition was full of favorites. In a world post-Pelé, the competition was filled with talented teams and star players across the board. The Italians had Dino Zoff, Inter's duo of Facchetti and Mazzola, along with Milan's captain Rivera, while the Dutch had Cruyff and Total Football under the manager Rinus Michels. And of course the champions West Germany had Gerd Müller, Beckenbauer and the keeper Meyer.
West Germany are world champions!
In 4th position, the 1958 World Cup in Sweden. 16 nations participated and the average tournament Elo is 18.8. 12 out of these 16 nations were European, which is pretty incredible. This was the iteration which introduced us to the teenage phenomenon Pelé, who led his team to their first World Cup win ever. It was also the iteration which saw the Frenchman Just Fontaine score a record-breaking 13 goals in only 6 matches, an unbroken record which still stands today. The hosts Sweden, under the leadership of their captain Lidholm, managed to get to the final, but the Brazilians with Pelé, Vava and Garrincha were too much for the Swedes. In third position, the 1962 World Cup in Chile. 16 nations participated and the average tournament Elo was 18.8. Despite the absence of teams like Sweden and France, the tournament was still strong, with 10 nations from Europe and 5 from South America. Only Mexico were the only national team outside these two continents. Brazil continued on their historic run and picked up their second World Cup in a row. They won it despite Pelé's injury in the second match of the group stage. Young players like Amarildo and Garrincha stepped up with great performances, as Garrincha was joint top goal scorer with his teammate Vava and other players. Violence infamously erupted in a match between Italy and host Chile in what was called the Battle of Santiago. The Chileans were the surprise of the tournament as they got to the semi-finals with basically a squad of unknown players and finished in third position. The Czechoslovakian team succeeded in getting to the final for the second time in their history, but the Brazilians were the best side in the tournament and won by 3-1.
Barber has it in the net. 3-1 to Brazil.
In second position, the 1966 World Cup in England. 16 teams participated and the average tournament Elo is 18.8. 10 nations from Europe, 4 from South America, Mexico, and for the first time in their history, North Korea from Asia. There was a tactical shift in this iteration, as more teams played defensively, evident with the fact that England kept a clean sheet in all matches all the way to the semi-finals against Portugal. Portugal were in their first World Cup appearance ever. With their star Eusebio, they played a fantastic tournament and earned the third position. North Korea surprised everybody after winning against Italy and qualifying to the second round, while Brazil also surprised everybody, but in a negative way, as Pelé was targeted with kicks and tough tackles and crashed out of the group stage. England finally won their first World Cup at Wembley in a thrilling final against the West Germans.
It is now.
And at first position, the 1978 World Cup in Argentina, the last iteration that had 16 participants before FIFA's controversial decision to increase the number of participants to 24 teams in the following World Cup. It had an average tournament Elo of 19 points. Despite the absence of teams like England, European champions Czechoslovakia, and the Soviet Union, the tournament is still considered the strongest in history based on Elo. The tournament had 10 European nations, 3 from South America, Mexico, and for the first time in their history, Iran representing Asia and Tunisia representing Africa. Away from all the controversy of the tournament and around the Argentinian team, this iteration contains the strongest group of nations ever. It was the only tournament that had 5 nations exceed the 2000 Elo rating mark. Even rookie nations like Iran and Tunisia were no pushovers at all, as Tunisia were the first African and Arab nation to win a match at the World Cup. The Austrians surprised everybody after passing a group which contained nations like Brazil, Sweden, and Spain. The Cruyffless Dutch team were still one of the favorites and managed to get themselves in the final. The hosts Argentina were boosted by names like Passarella and Mario Kempes' 6 goals, which made him the top goalscorer. They got to the final to face the Dutch and won the tournament for the first time in their history. To get the full picture, let's now see the weakest 5 World Cup iterations in history. The 5th weakest World Cup was the 1950 iteration in Brazil. It had an average tournament Elo of 18 points. It was the first World Cup after the hiatus of the Second World War. This iteration had 16 spots in qualification, but nations like India, Scotland, and Turkey had to withdraw from the tournament, as the competition ended up having 13 participants. The host Brazil set the World Cup on fire, with their striker Ademir scoring a tournament-best 6 goals. The Brazilians were the only team that had an Elo rating over the 2,000 points mark. The holders Italy had their squad severely weakened by the Superga air disaster back in 1949, which killed most of the great Torino squad. It was also the first World Cup ever for England after they became a FIFA member for the second time. However, it was not their best showing as they crashed out of the first round with only 2 points. It was the first and only World Cup without an actual final. 4 teams that passed their groups participated in a final round group. That last round resulted in Uruguay winning at the Maracana after winning a crucial match against Brazil in an unofficial final. The 4th weakest World Cup in history was the 1934 iteration in Italy. the second World Cup ever, and the first to feature a qualifying round beforehand, which resulted in a 16-team World Cup. It had an average tournament ELO of 17.9. It was the only World Cup that didn't feature the holders, in this case Uruguay, whom refused to participate in protest against several European countries whom refused to travel to South America for the first World Cup in 1930. British national teams refused to compete because they had a busy schedule with their own home nations championship, which was more important to them than the World Cup. Internal disputes within the Argentinian national team meant that their whole team from 1930 refused to participate. The Argentinians had to participate with an all-amateur team. It was one of the few competitions that had as much as 6 teams with an Elo rating between 1500 and 1700. The Italians won against Czechoslovakia in the final and earned their first World Cup ever. The third weakest World Cup in history was the 2010 iteration in South Africa. The average tournament ELO was 17.9. 32 teams from 6 confederations participated in this iteration, and it was the first World Cup hosted by Africa. North Korea shocked everybody by qualifying to the World Cup, basically taking Saudi Arabia's place. Many long-time absentees were back in this iteration, like New Zealand, Honduras, and Algeria. Newly independent nations like Serbia and Slovakia participated for the first time. It was the first time that the host nation gets eliminated from the first round. It was also the first time only 6 European teams advanced to the second round. The competition saw huge disappointments like France ending up with a single point, Italy finishing with 2 points, and England losing their group to the USA. Eventually, the best 4 sides got to the semi-finals as Spain beat the Netherlands in the final after extra time to lift their first World Cup in history.
¡Campeón del mundo! ¡Campeón del mundo! ¡Campeones España!
The second weakest World Cup in history was the 1938 iteration in France. Average tournament ELO was 17.1. It had 16 teams participate originally, however Austria had to withdraw after the annexation of the federal state of Austria into the German Reich. It was the first time that this few nations outside of the host continent participated in a World Cup, as out of the 15 participants, 12 were from Europe, as the rest were Brazil, Cuba, and the Dutch East Indies, or Indonesia as they're called today. The Italians with names such as Giuseppe Meazza and Silvio Piola were the only nation that had an ELO rating above 2000. Teams such as Cuba and the Dutch East Indies lowered the average ELO rating heavily. Even the Germans, who ended up acquiring some of Austria's players, were still not considered one of the favorites. In the end, the competition saw the 4 best nations arrive to the semi-finals, as the Italians managed to keep their title after winning against the Hungarians in the final. The weakest World Cup in history was the 1930 iteration in Uruguay. Average tournament ELO was 16.7, which is considered the weakest by some margin. FIFA handed Uruguay the honor to host after the idea of the competition gathered support in the 1920s, following the popular Olympics final in 1924. It was the only World Cup without qualification, as all FIFA members were invited. But because air travel was still not common in 1930, some nations forfeited, as the tournament ended up hosting only 13 nations. A total of 7 South American nations participated, which is considered a record. 2 from North America, and only 4 nations from Europe. The British home nations refused to participate. They were one of the few nations that had a professional football league. And on the topic of professionalism, all of the participating nations had no local professional leagues. The United States had a professional soccer league that lasted a single season back in 1894. Mexico had a professional national team starting from 1927, but no professional league. The rest of the nations were considered amateurs. This is why, despite it being the weakest tournament, it could be regarded as the most important. Most countries introduced professionalism in their football leagues only 1 or 2 years after the 1930 World Cup. It was hugely impactful in collecting the needed fan interest, which pushed the decision to go professional later on. Uruguay beat Argentina to write their names in history as the first World Cup winners. Ranking the strength of the tournaments is only one part of the study, but what's important to me was ranking the difficulty of each World Cup triumph by using the ODR formula we explained earlier. We also explained all the pieces of data we need, but let's take a quick example to fully understand the formula. The 62 World Cup won by the Brazilian national team is ranked as the third strongest World Cup tournament in history based on Elo. Let's see where it ranks based on the difficulty of the triumph. The average tournament Elo was 18.8, which is ranked in third position historically. The Champions Elo, which is the Elo of Brazil after the end of the tournament, 21.93, which is considered the second strongest champion in history. The average path Elo, which is the average Elo of all the nations the Brazilians had to face from the group stage all the way to the final, 19.21, and the result is an ODR of 16.06. So despite the strength of the tournament, the ODR is ranked in the middle of the pack between all iterations. In other words, Brazil competed in one of the strongest iterations in World Cup history, but their achievement in lifting the cup is not considered one of the toughest in the history of the competition. Let's look at the results now, the 5 toughest World Cup wins in history. In at 5th position, we have the Italian triumph of 1982 on Spanish soil. The average tournament Elo was 18.4, which is ranked historically in 8th position. The champion Elo, which is the Elo of Italy after the end of the tournament, 20.66, which is ranked in 15th historically. The average path Elo was 19.27, which is ranked as the third hardest in history. And this gives us an ODR of 16.98, enough for 5th position in our rankings. Italy were not underdogs per se. They had an Elo rating enough to position them within the top 5 of the tournament. Their path included a tough group stage, which saw them become the first team in World Cup history to advance out of the groups without winning a single match, drawing all 3 of their games. They were also the only World Cup winner to draw or lose 3 matches at the finals. They managed to score 12 goals in 7 matches. This all came after the biggest Serie A scandal in history, which happened in 1980, where national players were suspended for match fixing and illegal betting. Italy's triumph is considered one of the hardest in history for that reason, and also because they passed the second group stage over Argentina and Brazil. Many historians and analysts argue that this was Brazil's finest World Cup team ever. They entered the tournament on a 19-match unbeaten run, having scored 46 goals and conceding just 10 in the process, while boasting a squad of stars like Eder, Falcao, Socrates, Zico, and many more. But Paolo Rossi's hat-trick eliminated them from the competition, as Italy then won against Poland and West Germany in the final. With Rossi's 6 goals, Dinozzov's goalkeeping brilliance, and Tardelli's iconic celebration, Italy were 3-time champions. In 4th position, England's World Cup triumph at home in 1966. The average tournament Elo was 18.8, ranking it in 2nd position historically. The champion Elo, which is England's Elo after the tournament, 20.8, which is ranked 11th historically. Their average path Elo was 19.08, which is considered the 5th hardest path in history, and this gave us an ODR of 17.07, which was enough for 4th position. England entered the tournament as one of the strong favorites along with Brazil, while eventual finalist West Germany were considered underdogs before the World Cup, but this iteration showed us an entirely different story. England impressed throughout the competition, playing efficiently and conceding a single goal before entering the final, while West Germany caught the eye of the masses as a 20-year-old Beckenbauer was impressive as his team advanced to the final against all odds. By that time, West Germany were not yet considered England's bogey team. Actually, on the contrary, England had an impressive record against the Germans prior to the '66 final. In the previous 7 matches, England won in 6 and drew a single match. The final at a stacked Wembley stick to the script, as Jeff Hurst managed to score a hat-trick against the Germans, as England won in what is considered the greatest and most thrilling final ever. In 3rd position, West Germany's World Cup triumph on Swiss soil in 1954. The average tournament Elo was 18.5, ranking it in 6th position historically. The champion Elo, which is West Germany's Elo after the tournament, 20.92, which is ranked in 9th position historically. Their average path Elo was 19.81, which is ranked as the hardest path in history. This gave us an ODR of 17.35, enough for 3rd position in our rankings. This World Cup was a record-breaking tournament in many facets. It holds records that are yet to be broken. One of those records is the average goals per game, which was 5.38, basically an impossible feat today. It was the first World Cup to have television coverage, as fans were introduced to the great Hungary side of the 50s, led by Ferenc Puskás. This Hungary side were a goal-scoring machine, the likes that the World Cup have never seen before and after. That Hungarian side still hold the record for scoring the most goals in a single World Cup tournament, as they scored an astonishing 27 goals in only 5 matches. But this was sadly not Hungary's time for glory. It was a story of an underdog, a story about never giving up, a story of the last time was Germany were considered outsiders in a World Cup. The Germans entered the World Cup with a team full of amateurs, as they still didn't have a professional league back home. They were also competing for the first time after the Second World War. They successfully progressed through the group stage despite losing 8-3 against favorites Hungary. They passed both Yugoslavia and Austria, whom were no weaklings entering the tournament, as they pushed through to set up a rematch against Hungary in the 1954 final. Despite the difficulty of the task, and after conceding 2 goals in the first 8 minutes, the West Germans never gave up and came back in the match thanks to an 84th minute goal by Helmut Rahn, which saw them win the final in what was labeled the Miracle of Bern.
Deutschland ist Weltmeister!
In second position, Uruguay's World Cup triumph on Brazilian soil in 1950. The average tournament Elo was 18 points, ranking it in 17th position historically. The champion Elo, which is Uruguay's Elo after the tournament, 18.71, which is ranked as the weakest World Cup champion in history. Their average path Elo was 18.13, which is ranked as the 3rd easiest path in history. This gave us an ODR of 17.46, enough for 2nd position in our rankings. The situation surrounding the 1950 World Cup was explained earlier, from depleted teams to the refusal of some nations in participating. Nonetheless, Uruguay's triumph is still considered one of the greatest achievements ever. The hosts Brazil were considered strong favorites entering the tournament and went on the final group stage with ease, while Uruguay were not one of the favorites and were considered the 6th strongest team based on Elo. It was the only World Cup in history that didn't host a final. It had a final group stage which contained 4 teams who won their groups in the first round. However, the final match between Uruguay and Brazil was a final in all but name. Brazil needed only a draw to lift their first title in history, while Uruguay needed a win to lift their 2nd World Cup. The Maracanã Stadium was built for this purpose, for Brazil to come out victorious and lift the World Cup in front of 200,000 fans, as was reported, which is still the highest attendance of any World Cup match ever. The stadium was shaking when Brazil opened the scoring shortly after halftime, as the fans were ready to celebrate. But the Brazilians were silenced as Uruguay came back in the match and scored 2 goals in the last 24 minutes. Till today, this is considered one of the biggest upsets in football history, as the match was labeled Maracanazo, the Maracanã Smash. In first position and the hardest triumph in World Cup history, Argentina's achievement on home soil in 1978. The average tournament Elo was 19 points, ranking it as the strongest in history. The champion Elo, which is Argentina's Elo after the tournament, 20.39, which is ranked as the 4th weakest champion in history. Their average path Elo was 19.46, which is ranked as the 2nd hardest path in history. This gave us an ODR of 18.08, enough to make it the toughest triumph in history by a hefty margin. We briefly mentioned earlier that this is considered the strongest World Cup ever, but the 1978 iteration could be labeled as the most controversial as well, full of politics and propaganda. The World Cup was also marred by controversy on the pitch as well. Despite these issues, the Argentinian team had to stay focused on their objective, to lift their first World Cup title in history. Despite the head coach omitting a talented teenager named Maradona from the final squad for the World Cup, Argentina had still enough talent to do the job. First, Argentina had to go through a tough group stage with the likes of Italy, France and Hungary, which they succeeded in doing after coming in 2nd. The 2nd group stage was trickier. They had strong European outfit Poland and Peru, whom were group winners in the first round, and also arch rivals Brazil. In this round, only the group winners will qualify for the final, as Argentina won against Poland and then drew with Brazil in an outright war on the pitch. The last round of the group was filled with controversy. Brazil and Argentina were level on points going into the last round. The only issue was the scheduling of these particular matches. Brazil had to face Poland almost 3 hours before the match between Argentina and Peru. This meant that Argentina knew what kind of result they needed to qualify beforehand. Some say that this was a clear example of favoritism for the Argentinians, while others simply pointed to a logistics issue, which was intended to allow as many people as possible in the stadium safely. 2 matches at the same time would prevent that. In all cases, Brazil played their match and won 3-1. That meant that Argentina needed to win by 4 goals against an already eliminated Peru in the last match to book a place in the final. Argentina won by 6 goals to 0. Argentina faced the Netherlands without Cruyff, whom refused to participate in the tournament. The final was full of tension and fouls, but 71,000 fans supported Argentina until their last breath. Mario Kempes continued his scoring form and scored twice, with the sealer coming from Daniel Bertoni in extra time, to gift Argentina their first World Cup ever, which is considered the toughest in history.